I've just been to hear Mitch McConnell, see Mitch McConnell in a speech, Chamber of Commerce luncheon, and I was going to summarize the speech, and I'm a Democrat and he's a Republican, so try to be kind of neutral. It was an excellent speech too, and part of the reason I went was because see if he would freeze, and he didn't freeze. So one of the first things he said was he's a pork barrel politician. He brought $7 billion for the chemical, which is here in Kentucky, and I was thinking it was $3 billion. So 6%, and then he started talking about military, foreign affairs. 6% of GDP in Reagan years for the military. So he liked Reagan, and he said he was talking about. His party was isolationist prior to World War II. And they opposed FDR's Lend-Lease program to the British, until Pearl Harbor. And then he said after World War II, they were kind of isolationist still because of they didn't want NATO and they didn't want the Marshall Plan. So he was saying how in the Reagan years, he appreciated Reagan built up the military. He said 6% of GDP was devoted to military in Reagan years. But he said during World War II, 27% of GDP went to military. And so this is an argument about why we need to be in Ukraine so that we don't have World War III as the it because it would be a lot more expensive. He says Europe is doing more than USA in Ukraine. He says Japan and South Korea and the Pacific nations support Ukraine. He didn't say specifically they support financially, it was verbally. He opposed the withdrawal from Afghanistan, which I've heard him say before, because he said it was, we weren't doing much in Afghanistan anyway, it wasn't costing very much money, and I would assume he would also say it wouldn't cost very much in lives, soldiers' lives. Personally, I say we were there 20 years, it's long enough. And, nothing changed in 20 years. But he said it would have been better to stay there and keep a lid on, I think is how he says. Keep a lid on the terrorism. So he wants more military dollars. And he started talking about the election, and he says how most people have already made up their minds. And, of course, with the Electoral College, what it boils down to is 7 states. 7 states where there are people that haven't made up their minds. And so 7 states in play, and he named them. Georgia, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, Nevada, Arizona. And I just got the letters, so I did pretty good too. I can read it just from the first letters. And then he said, and so one thing about, I think Mitch McConnell's a real person. He has real a moral compass, and which might not be the same as mine, but still he has one. And so he is able to say things like he gives credit to the Democrats for replacing Biden. He says replacing Biden was a smart move on the part of the Democrats. He favors freer trade. So he's not frankly, Trump doesn't like him. Trump hates him, frankly. And he's not going to do what he has to do, kiss the ring, as they say. So he favors freer trade. He talked for some time about, and he gave credit to Obama for getting involved in the Pacific Trade Agreement. And then he mentioned how both candidates in 2016 opposed it, which was really a mistake on Hillary's part. She flip-flopped on that. And he says how it's popular nowadays to not like trade and to think trade's going to take my job. But he says, in fact, trade creates an enormous amount of jobs in USA. That's what he said. And economic professors generally, you get an advantage. The lower there's a huge advantage for the USA. But anyway, then he did something that was not particularly fair. I don't think. He blamed inflation on the $2.6 trillion spending by the Democrats. So, of course, he's ignoring the Trump previous spending by the Republicans, but also, and I think he's talking about the CHIPS Act and the Inflation Reduction Act is the 2.6 trillion is what he's talking about, because later on he praises the infrastructure. So anyway, I listened to economists, and they don't agree that this is the cause. First of all, most of them say COVID had a part in it, besides any money involvement, but COVID itself, the nature of it, and then when it went away, but anyway, he specifically blamed 2.6 trillion inflation. He blamed that for causing inflation. He also said the border wasn't chaotic during the previous administration. So he was talking about, if he was running for president, he'd be harping on two issues, inflation and the border. So the border he said the border was not chaotic during the previous administration, which he didn't mention the name of the president at that time. He just said previous administration. But one thing I would point out real quickly, separating children from their mothers, but he didn't say anything about that. Here is a place where he didn't exactly freeze, but he started to talk about the future, and then he never really did. He never really did. He started saying how young people think the country is so messed up, and then he kind of went back to Ukraine. He went back to Israel, which he said he was going to talk about before. He said, as far as Israel goes, if you're in a war, you want to win it. So he doesn't like this idea that the far left, the left or far left, however you look at it, is criticizing Israel for an enormous amount of deaths of Palestinians. I don't disagree with that. But he mentioned how the Hamas started it. He mentioned how Hamas started it, which you can't. And he mentioned, like, if this was happening in Canada or Mexico, we wouldn't put up with it. He mentioned how he wants the local army depot to produce shipboard containers, which I think is ridiculous, because you need steel, which is cheaper out of here. There's a 25% tariff on steel here. And in addition, welding, everything's expensive here. And in addition, we've got too many containers here anyway, because they ship them here from China, and then there's nothing to ship back. But anyway, he said he wants to build, but he's a pork barrel politician. Then he did mention how there's two different kinds of people. He says people that want to try and actually make a difference, and people that just want to make a name for themselves. So he says if you just watch the news and you rail about whatever, get on the news and rail about whatever. That's what he said. Is a person that doesn't really want to improve things. Then he started talking about infrastructure, which I mentioned how he didn't like the 2.6 trillion spending, but he did like the infrastructure spending. He said he was involved in it. He was involved in writing the bill. And he said, he also mentioned that his wife, who's Elaine Chao, and she was Secretary of Transportation at the time, his wife, and here he did mention Trump, couldn't do it. And if you remember too, Hillary said she was going to spend $1 trillion on infrastructure, and Trump said he was going to spend $2 trillion, but then he actually didn't do it because he was hoping private entities would do it out of the goodness of their hearts. But anyway, that's another story. So McConnell, again, being pork barrel, he said he got the Brent Spence Bridge built through the Infrastructure Act, and he said they had been talking about doing it with tolls. which nobody wanted to pay a toll. Well, I don't know about that. You know, I mean, to say if you use the thing, you should pay for it. But he says he got it built without tolls and through the Infrastructure Act. And then he also said $5 billion roads and bridges for Kentucky over 5 years. And so he's in favor of that. I wanted to mention one other thing. So what I want to mention is this book. He says this guy is writing his book about him, and it's not, he hasn't approved it. He's not approving it. The guy didn't ask his permission, he just told him. But then he said he kind of, in order to try and get a good, you know, shade, not shade, good sunlight or, you know, more favorable possibilities for the book, he said, let me introduce you to some people that like me. And so he was talking about the book. He gave everybody got a handout. It kind of seems like he's promoting the book, but he doesn't necessarily, he says he hasn't read it. He said he's very interested in it. Release date October 29, which is not very far away. But one thing I wanted to point out was the subtitle of this book, so I'll just read it. The Price of Power, that's the title of the book, and there's a picture of Mitch right there. The Price of Power. It says, how Mitch McConnell mastered the Senate, okay, changed America, and lost his party. So that last part, they didn't allow question and answer, but that would be what I would say is, does he agree he lost his party? And I think the answer could be yes, from a couple different points of view. For one thing, as I say, he's promoting this book. And the subtitle of the book is how he lost his party. For another thing, he is not kissing the ring, as a lot of, for instance, Lindsey Graham. And almost every Republican has to at this time. And he's not doing it. But he's also not running for re-election. That's about it. As I say, I don't want to be political in as much as when people get angry. Everybody has their own ideas. And one thing he mentioned too is how he says we tend to elect a split government. So half Republican, half Democrat. He says, why is that? He says, I think it's because we aren't in love with either party. And so we elect the split government so that neither party, you know, can run away with the things. And, well, that isn't what he said. What he said was, the split government, the parties have to get together and figure out what they can agree on and do that. So the things that are deal breakers on each side from the left and the right, the deal breakers don't get done. It's the center of the road that gets done. That's paraphrasing a bit what he said, but that's what he said. And so that's my little summary of Mitch McConnell's speech this afternoon. And as I said, it was really an excellent speech. It was really very good. And especially when you hear him talk about foreign policy, you can tell he's on the inside, you know. Another thing I'll add real quick is I'm kind of a cheap kind of a guy. I like a bargain. I like a Chinese tools because they don't cost very much money and they work. But Mitch is not like that. He has the pen. He has the power of the purse, as they call it in Congress. And he's not so much concerned with sort of saving money. Can we do this for less? He says, if we want to do this, I'll pay for it. He says, I got the money. If it needs to be done, we'll do it. And so I kind of think that's interesting to me because the amount of money we spend on the military is just fabulous. And they're just so inefficient. But what are you going to do about it? The only thing he can really do is give them more money. If they can't get it done, they just got to give them more money.